Well, so we're continuing this Confirmation 2.0, and we're going to be talking about Luther's big idea. But first I wanted to think with you about how the order of things really matters sometimes in life, the order of things. I learned this lesson recently. It was when Stephanie and my family and I moved to New Mexico. This happened in January, and so we had all our stuff packed up in a big truck, and these movers were going to drive it down. But it was a huge truck, and we were the first load, and there were going to be a few other trucks too. And they told us, well, we'll give you your stuff within 10 days. 2 weeks later, we still didn't have anything, and we were living in this little rental house. We just bought a new one, by the way, but a little rental house, and we had almost no stuff. We were kind of sleeping in our sleeping bags and eating dinner on the floor in our kitchen, and our poor kids had no toys, pretty much. They were just kind of running around playing with sticks and rocks in the yard, and our backyard was nothing but dirt. It was not finished at all. And so it was a Monday holiday where no one was working and there wasn't much to do, and we just thought, we're going to buy our kids a trampoline. And so we went to the store, bought one, came back and started putting it together. Problem was, we didn't read the instruction manual. And being a guy, I was absolutely opposed to the idea of reading an instruction manual. That was a preposterous idea. And so we just started putting it together, and we got the big metal ring together pretty well. And then it came time to connect the canvas. And if you know how this works, there's these little hooks and there's these little rings on the canvas, and you kind of pull the canvas towards the hooks and the rings, and you put them together. But again, we didn't read the instruction manual, so we just started kind of randomly connecting hooks and rings, a few here and then a few over there and a few there. And what happened is it became incredibly hard to pull the canvas the way it needed to go. And it turned into a disaster pretty soon. Me and Stephanie, we were pulling with all our might, but we just couldn't get the thing where it would go. There was this little hook contraption that you use to pull the rings towards the hooks that you're connecting to. And we would pull as hard as we can, and then it would snap free, and the hook we were holding would come back and cut our hands. And pretty soon, we're sitting there with gashes all over our hands, laying there defeated, out of breath, and wondering how anyone ever puts together trampolines. In fact, it was such a disaster that I did the most defeated thing a man could do, and I read the instruction manual. And I learned that the order really matters when you're putting together a trampoline. It turns out the way you're supposed to do it is you pull one of the rings and the hooks together on one side, and then you go to the complete opposite diametric side and do that one, and then you go to in between those two and do that one, and then again. And so you're sort of making crosses at equal distances as you go. And by doing this, you spread the tension, the weight out equally so that you're not pulling against 5 hooks at the time to get one. And what do you know? That was our light bulb moment. The order of things mattered, and pretty soon the trampoline was together and the kids were happy, and we were happy too. Well, just as the order of things matters sometimes in putting together trampolines and other things, sometimes the order of things matters in faith too. And as we continue exploring our Confirmation 2.0 series, I wanted to think with you about Martin Luther and his light bulb moment, which had a lot to do with the order of things in faith and the order of things in the way we understand God. And think with you about how his light bulb moment can be a light bulb moment for us too. But to understand Luther's transformation, it's helpful to explore his story. Luther, as you may know, came from what we now call Germany. At that time, it was part of this series of kingdoms called the Holy Roman Empire. He lived in the late 1400s to the middle of the 1500s, and he came from a pretty well-off family. They weren't royalty, but his father owned a number of copper mines. And his father's dream for his son was that he would enter law school, and by being part of law, he can support the family business. And Luther was a dutiful son, so he dutifully entered law school. He was bright, so he was doing pretty well. But legend has it, one day he was traveling on horseback through the woods. It was late at night, and suddenly a lightning storm swept through, and rain started coming down all around him, and the wind was blowing, and lightning was crashing down all around him, and he was terrified. He was terrified for his life. And in that moment of fear, he went down on his knees and begged God to spare him, and if God spared him, he vowed he would give his life to God. And he survived the lightning storm, and Luther was a man of his word, and he was very stubborn. And so he joined the monastery. He became a monk. That's how he interpreted giving his life to God. And this is interesting. He became a monk, which was a huge disappointment to his father, right, who wanted him to be a lawyer, which maybe helps explain his spiritual struggles later on how he viewed God. Because the thing about Luther was that he was extremely serious about his faith, extremely serious and very intelligent, very bright, but also he struggled with this incredible sense of guilt. He just never felt good enough in the eyes of God. He viewed God as an angry father, kind of looking down at him with disappointment, right? Feeling like he was never good enough, which, remember, was his experience with his own human father. And, despite doing everything that you were supposed to do, he prayed, he said thousands of Hail Marys, he read the Psalms, he confessed his sins. He just could never shake that feeling of terror that God was going to cast him into hell for his sinfulness because he didn't measure up. And even though he had some friends in the monastery who tried to encourage him and tell him, Luther, you're too hard on yourself, the thing that was worse was that the church at that time, their teaching and their practice sort of encouraged this mindset that God was going to come get you. You see, at this time, the church taught that your life was basically like a balance scale between good and bad. And what the church taught that was that your good needed to outweigh your bad. And the church was also very good at making people feel guilty. So pretty much no one felt like their good outweighed their bad. And so the church had answers for this. They had these different spiritual gymnastics you were supposed to play. And by doing this, you would make things right with God. So for instance, people would be told they needed to pray with relics. Relics are these old kind of pieces of saintly people, usually old bones and stuff of Saint so-and-so. And pray near these bones, and then you would get special forgiveness. Or, go to some holy site and get on your knees and recite the Lord's Prayer 50 times while crawling up the steps on your knees. Or worst of all, as Luther came to see it, was the selling of indulgences. Indulgences were these spiritual certificates that the church sold. And what they did was if you bought an indulgence, depending on how much you paid, you could get a certain amount of time off purgatory, or you can bail yourself out of hell, or you can bail out, grumpy Uncle Harry, who's already dead. You can bail someone else out of hell who you knew was probably going to go there because they were so mean. And so, basically forgiveness was for sale through this system. And so all this stuff fed into this worldview that taught people that it was necessary to make God love you. That we had to, in a sense, convince God through the things we did and even the things we bought from the church to forgive us and to love us through our good works. But Luther was bright, and so even though he was struggling spiritually, they continued to promote him. Pretty soon he became a priest, and then they sent him off to school, and he became a professor of the Bible. And what transformed Luther was actually opening the Bible and reading it. It's amazing to think, but many people of the faith, the lay people, but even the priest, didn't read the Bible very much. Only certain kind of highly educated people did. And when he read the Bible, and especially the New Testament, he discovered that the church's teaching did not align with what it actually said in the Gospels. And what saved Luther was the discovery that God's love in Christ comes first, right? That the love of God doesn't need to be and can't be earned, and that that basically the order matters. That God's love comes before any love we have for God. And over time, you'll sometimes hear in Lutheranism this fancy formula that says justification by grace through faith. That comes kind of through Paul's language, which is a good phrase. But I think the simpler way to say it is that God's love comes first. And we see this idea all over the New Testament. We see it in both of our readings from today, where Jesus first says, "You did not choose me, but I chose you," right? So God chooses us before we can ever choose God. And then as Paul puts it, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God and not the result of works." So Luther's big idea was grace. And in truth, that wasn't his idea. It was the rediscovery of an old idea of what Christ was saying all along. But you know, the very fact that grace had to be rediscovered and kind of re-emphasized points out to a reality that we really struggle with grace as human beings. Grace is hard for the human brain to comprehend because we kind of like, if you do this, you equally get this back, right? We like to earn things. And we sort of prefer love and respect that's earned because, it's easier for our egos if we feel like we earned it. You hear people say that a lot. I don't want anything given to me that I haven't earned. And also, there's kind of a flip side that if it's earnable, then we get to sit in God's place and judge people on whether they've earned it or not, right? And we love that. We love to play God. But the problem is we can't be trusted to judge in God's place. We can't even always be trusted to judge ourselves in God's place. We make poor gods. For example, how many of us are our own harshest critics? Not everyone. Not everyone has a guilty conscience, but some people really do, right? And just like Luther, how many of us have that inner voice that says, you're a mess, Why don't you do better? Why don't you be better? You don't deserve this. You don't deserve God's love. You're not worthy. Or even at its worst, you're worthless, right? You're no good. Now, some might say, even within their faith, isn't this just a guilty conscience? And the answer is no, it isn't. To be sure, there is such a thing as positive guilt. That has to do with feeling proper remorse for our sins. Sometimes we feel guilty. That's okay. But a healthy conscience always remembers that we're also fearfully and wonderfully made. And therefore, it doesn't take that next step of saying you're worthless, right? And that's the problem with us judging in God's place. We tend to want to throw away people, and even ourselves, who God loves. There's a story I heard that was really sad, but I think it illustrates this point. A pastor told me this story. There was a man in her church who had started really getting involved, and he was helping them do some stuff in the church. And through this, she was learning his story. The story goes that this young man hadn't been going to church. He'd kind of been living a rough life for a while. But it was Mother's Day, and so he wanted to please his mother, so he was going to go to church with his mom on Mother's Day. And so he went to church, participated in the service. It came time for communion. At that church, you kneel, so he kneeled down to receive his communion. And as he was about to receive it, his mother slapped his hand down and said, "You are not worthy. What do you think you're doing?" What a horrible thing for your mom to do. And this was horrible for him. He felt horrible about himself. But, it kind of in a way also made him want to be good enough. And so he interacted with the pastor and said, "How can I help?" And they had these old pews that were kind of getting in bad shape. So he started, he was good at woodworking. So he refinished all of them and made them look beautiful. And then it came to be Thanksgiving, and he was sitting there at the meal. And apparently this conversation played out between him and his mom saying, "Hey, I've done all this stuff for the church. Am I worthy now, Mom? Am I good enough?" And even with that, there's two things for me that are sad about this story. The first thing is that the mom didn't think that God was a God of grace, didn't really believe in grace, even for her own son. For her, God was more about rejecting people and judging them than God was about loving them. And then the other sad thing about this story is that this poor man is being fed a form of faith that will inevitably imprison him to this endless cycle of trying to earn God's love, trying to be good enough. And of course, the problem with this kind of faith is you're never good enough, because no sooner do you conquer one type of flaw, you can always find another flaw in yourself. There's always another requirement we can create for ourselves that will make us good enough. It's always in front of us. And here's the thing, that's not real love, because all love that's real is unconditional. Every other kind of love is just payback. If love is just you love me and then I'll love you back, and then if you don't love me right, I'm not going to love you, that's not love. That's just scheming to get something in return. Real Christ-like love always comes as a gift. It's like when a beautiful baby is born, and we could ask the question, what must that child do to earn the parent's love? And the answer, of course, is, if it's any kind of parent, nothing, right? The child doesn't have to do anything. The child is going to be loved by the nature of parents love their children. Maybe not all of them do, but anyone that's worth their salt, their weight in salt, loves their parents. And we could even push it further and ask, what must the child do to make themselves no longer lovable by the parents, right? What would the kid have to do to make their parents stop loving them? And again, the answer is, if the parent's any kind of parent, pretty much nothing, right? The kid could probably mess up their life a whole lot and be really cruel. The kid could probably make their parent really sad and really disappointed in them. But, when I think about my own children, even if they live the worst life imaginable, there's pretty much nothing they could do that would make me stop loving them. And I think most of us get this with human parents, and yet we struggle to get it with God, right? And why do we think anything less of God than we would of a human parent, right? Why would we think the less of God than we think that we can do when we love? So Luther's big idea is that we put grace at the center of our image of God, that we put grace at the center of our faith, and that we put grace at the center of our lives. And it's this message to remember that God's love always comes first, which means that we can escape this never-ending guilt cycle and replace it with joy, and replace it with thanksgiving. And what this means, last of all, is that we get to look at our neighbors, even the ones that really annoy us, and think about how much God must have loved them to die for them on the cross. And we realize that we must owe that person our love too, because of how much God loved them. So that's our message for today, that Luther rediscovered, that God's love comes first and that everything else can come after.